Greetings and welcome to another video. Brother Captain Morgan here in the Librarius with what I hope is an interesting exploration of some of the lore and themes from Games Workshop's Warhammer 40k franchise. Today's video is a companion video to the latest article I published in my philosophy series, which you can check out on frontlinegaming.org. If you haven't already, please take the opportunity to visit their website where this and the other articles of my 40k philosophy series are hosted. At some point in the future, I will be creating audio versions of all of these articles for people to listen to. Because of how long the articles are, and because audio is so much more accessible than text nowadays, I felt it would be a good idea to create some versions of these, what are essentially thought exercises in an audio format. Today, we will be talking about the symbolism in the Fall of the Eldar, and how it connects and relates to myths and stories from our own history. This is my first attempt at drawing connections to Xenos lore, and I hope that you enjoy hearing it as much as I enjoyed exploring it. Without further preamble, let's jump right in. Part 1. An introduction to Eldar mythology and its connections to our own. Many cultures have asked questions about the origins of life in the world we occupy. Our history has a wide variety of creation and origin stories. Legends like Marduk and his clash against Tiamat, the great dragon of chaos from the Mesopotamian myth cycle, the formation of Midgard from the body of a dead giant in Norse mythology, the creation of the world from a great sea at the rising of the sun as depicted in Egyptian mythology, as well as the commonly known account from the Old Testament of the Abrahamic religions. Many of these stories borrow from each other in many different ways as they have influenced each other across history, and many of their themes have made their way into the creation mythology of 40k. I should make note here that I'm not trying to make a case that 40k origin stories are just carbon copies of old myths, but instead I am saying that the themes of old myths and stories have undoubtedly influenced these works. Consequently, the morals and themes derived from the Eldar mythology will resonate with the ones they are rooted from. Far from being simple Easter eggs, these tie-ins resonate with readers, as do the themes, and the connections between these narratives offer greater symbolic meaning when analyzed side by side. As an example of this, the Eldar have a full pantheon of gods that take a nod to many different aspects of mythology from history. This pantheon touches on many of the traditional themes common among pantheons we are familiar with, such as having a ruling god, Assyrian, who is like Odin, Ra, or Zeus, who presides over the pantheon. At odds with this order, of course, is Cain, a god of war and murder, often in conflict with the other gods and with mortals, much like Hades, Ares, and Set. There's also a goddess of the harvest, life, and healing named Isha, who is like Freya, Isis, Isha from Indian mythology, and Hera to a lesser extent as well. Heg, the goddess of fate, was part of a trinity of goddesses that resemble the three crone seers of Greek mythology. A trickster god, Kekarok, is much like Loki or Hermes, who seek to get the better of their peers and set them against each other for their own satisfaction or to pursue their own designs. Each god in the Eldar pantheon has their mythic cycles, with tales of war and symbolic allegory that impact how the Eldar speak and interact with each other. Even the Exodites, considered the most primitive or perhaps most rural of the Eldar, have a pantheon of animal gods, much like the tribal societies past and present. It should surprise us very little, then, that the main themes of the Eldar pantheon touch on many of the same points and teach many of the same lessons our own myths do. Many of the Eldar's specific mythological tales are unknown to us as an audience simply because they have not been written in more than vague terms or hints in codexes or short stories. Some tales, such as the War in Heaven and the Fall of the Eldar, are much more easily relatable to stories from history, such as the Fall of Man from Genesis in the Old Testament, and the story of Cain and Abel from that same book. I'm focusing on these connections for this reason, but I wanted to make sure to give some attention to how many of our own mythological stories show up in lore of the Eldar. Part 2. The Fall of the Eldar. The Fall of the Eldar is probably the single most important lore event in Warhammer 40k, outside from the Horus Heresy, and certainly the most influential Xenos lore in terms of impact on the galaxy. I touched on the Fall of the Eldar and the War in Heaven in my articles on both the Eldar and the Necrons, but I will summarize the key points here. With the Necrons seemingly defeated after their long and terrible war, the Eldar race languished in victory. Created by the Old Ones before their death at the hands of the C'tan and their Necron slaves, the Eldar are flawed because of the rushed nature of their design. The Old Ones gave them an incredible psychic potency as a means of fighting the soulless Necrons, and its intensity meant that the Eldar have a depth of emotion and experience that exceeds that of other races. To the Warp, which is a collection and a reflection of the emotional and spiritual state of beings in the galaxy, this means that the Eldar had and have an incredible influence on that realm. Apparent victory against the Necrons set the Eldar free to pursue their own interests, much to the detriment of the galaxy. To put it simply, without challenge, the desires of the Eldar turned inward. They sought to satisfy their desires and whims without discipline amongst each other and across the stars. They set no limits to the depths that their depravity could reach, and set upon themselves with wild abandon, seeking new sensation after new sensation. The Eldar life and death cycle was a cycle of reincarnation, where a spirit would pass into a new body after death. In a society made of reincarnated spirits, it's easy to consider how a reincarnated soul lost to depravity would create a positive feedback loop of horrors as it lived and relived its own lack of satisfaction and sought new ways to make life interesting. This brings to mind a quote from Immanuel Kant, who is a German philosopher, or who was a German philosopher, I should say, during the Enlightenment period in Europe. The quote goes, "Give a man everything he wants, and at that moment, everything is not everything." In the Warp, the echo of the Eldar race's many horrors birthed a new chaos god, Slaanesh, who murdered or subdued nearly the entire Eldar pantheon. Slaanesh is made of the excesses of the Eldar, and has taken excess as its domain. The consequences of Slaanesh's arrival would change the galaxy forever, as the depravity of the Eldar would seduce and torment every living race of the galaxy from that time on. The real-world symbolism of this concept is too tantalizing for me to pass over. Do we as individuals mirror the self-destructive tendencies of our real and imagined societies? Yes. That's what makes them interesting and relatable, and our consideration of these narratives has value even if the events themselves may be fictional. Let me be clear also in expressing that I'm not saying that this is the only way to interpret any of these narratives, but I am instead trying to derive something useful and meaningful from these narratives as something for us to consider. Part 3. The Fall, Purpose, and Nihilism. The Fall as an idea existed long before the Eldar. In the Christian tradition, the Fall refers to the fall from grace when Adam and Eve were cast out from the Garden of Eden, a paradise of peace, safety, innocence, and plenty. By taking the forbidden fruit, Adam and Eve had disobeyed God, and were exiled from their appointed paradise to live as fallen beings who could no longer dwell in the presence of God, and they were now required to toil for their sustenance. As the story goes, among their first children were Cain, and Abel. We'll touch on that more in a bit. The Eldar story borrows somewhat from the idea of the fall of man, though not like a carbon copy. The Eldar had purpose in their war against the Necrontyr turned Necrons, but when that purpose was satisfied, the galaxy became their Eden. Without purpose and in a state of paradise, they grew bored. Life was cheap. Existence was without meaning beyond what they made for themselves. This brings to mind a favorite quote of mine from Dostoevsky. "Shower on him every blessing, drown him in a sea of happiness, give him economic prosperity such that he should have nothing else to do but sleep, eat cakes, and busy himself with the continuation of the species, and even then, out of sheer ingratitude, sheer spite, man would play you some nasty trick." Such was the truth with the Eldar. They had lost their purpose and turned inwards in a spiral of self-destruction that dragged their race from its prime into a shadow of its former self, desperately trying to slow or stave off its final death with failing strength. This is the part of the lesson in the Fall of the Eldar narrative. By embracing a mode of being that exists purely for the sake of your own satisfaction, and by drawing no moral boundaries around the actions of yourself and society, you create a demon that will destroy you. Much like the Eldar, the lesson can come too late, and just trying to be while the doom promised by that demon hangs over you means you have to work even harder just to keep ahead of it. This is the solution that the Craftworld Eldar, or the Asuryani nowadays, find. The discipline and focus that they have to maintain dominates their lives, and always Slaanesh, that demon, looms in the background with a promise of destruction, much like how alcohol looms in the background thoughts of a recovering alcoholic. A note on the Drukhari. It is important at this time to point out the differences in coping with the fall demonstrated by the Asuryani and the Drukhari. The Drukhari take a different path, a path that could be very easily likened to an addict. The Drukhari share their suffering with those around them, and everything in their lives becomes structured around the need to feed that addiction. Even in a universe as brutal as Warhammer 40k, being caught in the clutches of the Drukhari is often a contender for the worst fate a person could imagine. They are the end result of a nihilistic attitude and psychopathy. They have gone from living cruelly solely to pleasure themselves to living cruelly just to live. It represents a very real pattern of behavior that can come to people without purpose. One of the closest real-world comparisons I can make to the Drukhari approach to existence is the Columbine killers. I have included this excerpt from an article regarding their behavior here, and I don't think that I am the only one who can see the connection between the mindset of these very real people and the fictional horror dimension that the Drukhari occupy, once you understand them. Psychopaths follow much stricter behavior patterns than the rest of us because they are unfettered by conscience, living solely for their own aggrandizement. None of his victims means anything to the psychopath. He recognizes other people only as means to obtain what he desires. Not only does he feel no guilt for destroying their lives, he doesn't grasp what they feel. The truly hardcore psychopath doesn't quite comprehend emotions like love, hate, or fear, because he has never experienced them directly. Because of their inability to appreciate the feelings of others, some psychopaths are capable of behavior that normal people find not only horrific, but baffling. Hare, a clinical psychologist, writes. For example, they can torture and mutilate their victims with about the same sense of concern that we feel when we carve a turkey for Thanksgiving dinner. So, if you were about to make an argument that the Drukhari are surviving just fine after the fall with very little adverse effect, then I would say that perhaps you don't understand their way of life enough to consider it as just fine. I think you would have a hard time justifying how that is an acceptable mode of being to anyone who isn't a psychopath. I feel pretty comfortable asserting that being consigned to that sort of existence is an example of a fall, if not a metaphor for how hell isn't just a place you go when you die, and that you can create one while living, given enough time and enough effort. Part 4. Applications of the Fall Narrative. So, while there are some differences, the stories of the Fall of Man and the Fall of the Eldar share many of the same themes. You have a group that falls from a state of grace and loses access to paradise. They are left in an uncaring world, are separated from the divine, and are doomed to suffer and struggle until the final days. The Adam and Eve story asks questions about committing sin, where you may or may not believe in a divine being. As a person, it is easy to relate to knowing not to do something bad or wrong, whether this comes from a cultural or a personal moral stance, and doing it anyway, and how there are certain mistakes that a person can make that have life-changing consequences. There are things that a person can do that there is no coming back from. Anyone like myself who has watched someone struggle with addiction in ways that rob them of their potential can easily relate to the story of the Fall of Man, regardless of whether it was a literal history or not. In the same way, the Fall of the Eldar speaks to that on a societal scale, in that a society without boundaries, given to excess, will create the demon of its own destruction. A note on the Flood. The story of Noah's Ark is another biblical story that has possible relevance to the Fall of the Eldar narrative, but upon closer examination it didn't match up very well to me. While a comparison could be made between Slaanesh's arrival and the divine punishment that was meant to cleanse the world of sin by water, that is where the similarities end. Slaanesh was created from sin, not as a consequence of sin, and consumed the sinners with the power born from their own vileness, and continued to promulgate its evil upon the galaxy after their death. The flood was meant to cleanse the world and give it a fresh start. While the craft worlds could be considered arcs like Noah's, the survival of Gomorrah, a homonym for Gomorrah, a den of iniquity from the Old Testament, somewhat cheapens whatever cleansing effect Slaanesh's flood would have had. As such, while some connection can certainly be drawn, it doesn't work well enough as an analog for me to spend a lot of time putting it together. Part 5. Kane and Kane. Although only a short series of paragraphs in the Old Testament, the story of Cain is nonetheless packed with symbolic significance that has valid tie-ins with the story of the Fall of the Eldar. Cain and Abel, two brothers, are commanded to bring sacrifices to God. Cain's sacrifice is rejected, and he grows bitter over how much better his brother Abel is doing. Possessed by jealousy, resentment, and nihilism, Cain murders his brother in cold blood. Abel's blood cries out to God from the earth for vengeance, causing God to seek answers from a now sulking Cain. This is the first act of its kind among the children of Adam, and Cain is cast out and cursed because of his actions. This is significant for many reasons within the Abrahamic religions, but it ties into the Eldar myth in interesting ways as well. Cain seeks to kill the Eldar race after hearing a prophecy that they will be the reason for his destruction. This causes a war among the gods, also called the War in Heaven, though distinct from the Eldar war against the Necrons that carries the same name, which can get a little confusing. The Eldar, who used to be able to dwell among the gods, are separated from them by the decree of Asuryan, and now live in the mortal dimension. This mirrors the fall of man somewhat, in that Adam and Eve are no longer able to dwell in the presence of God, and that there was a war in heaven where the devil and those who sided with him were cast out before Eden was made. The war in heaven in the Eldar myth ends after Cain kills Eldanesh, the greatest Eldar champion and a mighty hero, in a duel. As a mark for this deed, Cain's hands drip blood from that time forward, giving him the name Cain the Bloody-Handed, a god of murder. This is interesting, as Isha is the goddess of earth and the harvest, and the blood on Cain's hands mirrors somewhat the biblical story of the blood of Abel crying out from the earth, marking Cain for vengeance. The prophecy of Cain's destruction, of course, would eventually come to pass in the 40k narrative, as Slanesh would kill Cain and scatter him to pieces during the fall. Much like the biblical Cain, though, Cain's downfall wasn't a true death, as his lesser incarnations still exist. The murderers of Kane and Kane don't mirror each other as perfectly as their names do, but they share some themes. The biblical story of Cain is centered around sacrifice. Cain was dissatisfied because his sacrifice was rejected. The Bible doesn't explicitly state why it was rejected, but we know that in many traditions the act of animal sacrifice was considered more meaningful because it was a greater value than the plant offerings that Cain brought. There's also the possibility, and the likely possibility, that the sacrifice of animals was more symbolically significant. In a modern context, sacrifice is an act of negotiating with the future, in that denying ourselves of something we want now, we exchange it for prosperity in the future. We also know from the passage that Cain nurtured his feelings of anger and bitterness after he was rejected. The passage reads, "And in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord, and Abel he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering. But unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect, and Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. And the Lord said unto Cain, Why art thou wroth, and why is thy countenance fallen? If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted? And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door. And unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. And Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass that when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel his brother, and slew him." Psychologically speaking, people in the real world who live and wallow in their resentment produce disastrous outcomes for themselves and for others, as evidenced by many acts of murder-suicide, mass murder, and genocides. Kane and Kane exhibit this tendency, though on different scales and for motives that are somewhat different. The biblical Cain was the murderer of his brother, while Cain from the Eldar myth sought to murder the Eldar, and they pantomime human psychology with their motives and actions. We can, of course, extrapolate a moral of the biblical Cain story in a human society as an object lesson to mean that the value of what we give up or sacrifice to God or the future or existence, the state of reality, can't be done incorrectly or in a halfway fashion if we expect to get the best outcome. Additionally, responding to failure with nihilism, bitterness, and vengeance after our half-hearted efforts fails leads us to hatred for others, particularly those who seem to have it better off than we do. After all, someone like Abel is easy to hate because he succeeded where Cain failed, and he was blessed for it. In this sense, Cain created the circumstances that led to his downfall by not giving proper sacrifice, whatever that means, by dwelling in his feelings of hatred and envy, and eventually killing his brother. This is telling for another reason, because being blessed and having his sacrifice accepted didn't entitle Abel to immunity from the consequences of Cain's hatred. The lesson there being that you can still make the proper sacrifices and be favored by reality, God, your circumstances, whatever you want it to be, and then lose all of it because of others' inability to negotiate properly with reality or cope with the consequences. Could Cain have bettered his circumstances by resetting himself and making the proper sacrifices? How much worse did Cain's life get after he acted out the resentment he nurtured in his heart? How often do we as individuals fall into this pattern and find only grief? There's a poem I'd like to read that I feel like is something that could have been written by Cain after everything that went down. It's called Invocation of One in Despair by Karl Marx. Now pay attention to the verbiage, to the different ways of saying things, and to the mentality of the author here, and see if you can draw any connections between this mindset and a Cain-like persona. So a god has snatched from me my all in the curse and rack of destiny. All his worlds are gone beyond recall. Nothing but revenge is left to me. On myself revenge I'll proudly wreak, on that being, that enthroned lord. Make my strength a patchwork of what's weak, leave my better self without reward. I shall build my throne high overhead, cold, tremendous shall its summit be. For its bulwark, superstitious dread, for its marshal, blackest agony. Who looks on it with a healthy eye shall turn back, struck deathly pale and dumb. Clutched by blind and chill mortality, may his happiness prepare its tomb. And the Almighty's lightning shall rebound from that massive iron giant. If he brings my walls and towers down, eternity shall raise them up, defiant. For Cain the Bloody-Handed's part, he created the circumstances of his own fall as well. By instigating the war in heaven, Cain the Bloody-Handed separated the gods from the Eldar, both physically and spiritually. Cut off from the guidance of their gods, the Eldar destroyed themselves, and the gods with them, with the birth of Slaanesh. Cain the Bloody-Handed's hatred and desire to kill the Eldar didn't come from anything they had done, but came over what he supposed or believed they would do. His motives were purely self-serving, and he justified what he did in the name of survival. Additionally, Eldanesh was killed by Cain despite being the ideal hero, much like Abel was considered good and blessed by God. This murder marked Cain the Bloody-Handed as surely as the biblical Cain was marked. Had Cain not acted in such a manner, could the fall of the Eldar have been avoided? Would the guidance of Asurian and the other gods have provided meaning and direction for the Eldar in such a way that would have prevented the downfall of their race and the birth of one of the four prime chaos gods? If we apply this to ourselves, do we often create the circumstances of our own fall by trying to prevent it in the wrong ways? Do we attack the wrong thing to avoid an undesired outcome, but instead steer ourselves towards that outcome under another guise? It's interesting to consider, and it's one of those things that you have to think within the universe are going on in conversations in Eldar halls with Eldar philosophers, and it would be interesting to see a discussion of this in a Black Library novel sometime. I hope you enjoyed this little foray into Xenos lore and human psychology and a little of our own history. It was a bit of a divergence from my usual focus on mankind's journey in the Grimdark, but I had a good time looking into it, and I feel like there was a lot more to cover that I could have done, but this was already dragging on pretty long. What connections to Eldar lore do you see or are the most interested in through history? I feel like there's a ton that I missed, particularly when it comes to Celtic references. One of the biggest things that I hear is for the same Han craft world, Samhain, which makes me think of some of the pagan traditions of the Celts. There's so much more to go into. I'd love to know the sort of things that, and the sort of connections that you are able to find. If you have any recommended reading, or if you have any thoughts about what we went into today, I'd love to hear it. Let me know in the comments. Thanks for sticking with me for this, and I hope you enjoyed this video and the ones to come. Please consider giving me a like and subscribing to this channel. I look forward to making more videos and having more interesting conversations in the future. Cheers.